The humid Tallahassee air hung thick and heavy, a tangible weight pressing down on the state capitol. It was a humid embrace that felt more like a shroud than a welcome. Inside the stark, imposing edifice of the Florida Attorney General's office, Pam Bondi, a woman whose political career had been as polished and gleaming as her signature power suits, felt the familiar hum of impending conflict. But this time, the hum was a dissonant thrum, a tremor beneath the surface of her meticulously constructed world. Her private office, usually a sanctuary of order and purpose, was abuzz with an unsettling undercurrent. Sunlight, usually a cheerful intruder, now seemed to cast long, accusing shadows across her mahogany desk. On the imposing oak desk sat a thin manila envelope, its contents innocuous at first glance. Yet Pam knew, she always knew. This wasn't about routine filings or policy briefs. This was a harbinger. "Anything from Jensen?" Pam asked, her voice a low, controlled melody, betraying none of the gnawing anxiety that had begun to coil in her gut. Her chief of staff, Marcus Thorne, a man whose loyalty was as steadfast as his gaze was sharp, stood opposite her, his brow furrowed with a familiar concern. He'd been with her since her first campaign, a silent guardian through every political storm. Marcus shook his head, his gaze fixed on the envelope. "Not yet, AG, but the whispers are growing louder. They're talking serious charges." Pam's jaw tightened. Serious charges. The words echoed in the quiet of her office, amplified by the unseen forces at play. She'd made enemies, of course. Every prosecutor, every politician who dared to stand firm, made enemies. But this felt different. This felt orchestrated, coordinated. "Who are they, Marcus?" she finally asked, her voice hardening, the velvet touch of authority laced with steel. "The usual suspects, but with a new ally," Marcus replied, choosing his words carefully. "James Comey. He's been unusually interested in your office's actions regarding the Trump University settlement, specifically, your initial refusal to investigate." Pam's breath hitched. Trump University. That was ancient history, a political football she'd punted away years ago. A decision that had caused a brief, localized firestorm, but had ultimately settled. Why now? Why Comey? Comey, the disgraced former FBI director? Pam scoffed, a brittle sound. What interest could he possibly have in a state-level settlement from half a decade ago? "Apparently," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "He's been digging, found some discrepancies, things that weren't in the public record, things that might suggest undue influence, or worse." Pam rose from her desk, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. She walked to the window, looking out at the manicured lawns of the Capitol grounds, a place that had always felt like her domain. Now it felt like a gilded cage. "Undue influence? I was doing my job, protecting Florida's consumers," she said, her voice tinged with a fierce protectiveness. "This whole Trump University thing was a political circus, and I refused to let my office be dragged into it for partisan gain." "And that's what you'll say?" Marcus affirmed, his gaze unwavering. "But Comey, as you know, has a flair for the dramatic, and a history of making things stick, whether they are true or not. This leak about him indicting you, it's already out there, Pam. The internet is a wildfire." Pam turned back, her eyes blazing. "Indicting me? For what? For not playing their political games? That's absurd. I followed the law, every step of the way." "The problem, AG, is that Comey isn't just a prosecutor anymore. He's a pundit. He's a commentator, and he's been cultivating sources. Leaks are coming from everywhere. Not just about Trump University, but about the appointment process for the judge who would oversee any potential case. They're suggesting you railroaded the process to get someone sympathetic." Pam's blood ran cold. The judge. She remembered the appointment process. It had been standard, procedural, or so she'd believed. "Who is this judge?" she asked, her voice a strained whisper. "Judge Eleanor Vance. She's new to the federal bench, appointed just over a year ago. Apparently, Comey's team has unearthed some communications, some emails that suggest a less than transparent selection process. They're framing it as a deliberate maneuver to secure an acquittal, or at the very least, a dismissal on procedural grounds. Pam paced the room, her mind racing. This was a carefully constructed trap. Comey, a man who had seemingly imploded his own career with controversial decisions, was now aiming his fire at her. But why? What was his motive? Was it revenge for some perceived slight? Or was it something far more insidious? A desperate attempt to regain relevance by dismantling a rising star? These discrepancies, these communications, are they real? Pam demanded, her gaze piercing Marcus. Marcus hesitated, a flicker of doubt in his usually stoic expression. That's what we're trying to ascertain, AG. The leaks are fragmented, designed to sow maximum confusion and damage. But the narrative is already taking hold. Pam Bondi indicted Comey for lying, 52 sec. Later, judge destroyed her case for illegal appointment. He recited the fabricated headline, the words a punch to the gut. It's already being amplified by every anti-Trump, anti-Republican outlet imaginable. They're calling it payback. Justice delayed. They're painting you as a corrupt official who used her power to silence a legitimate investigation. Pam stopped pacing, her hands clenched at her sides. The accusations, even as hypothetical as they were, felt like physical blows. She was known for her integrity, for her unwavering commitment to the law. To be painted as corrupt, it was anathema. Indicted for lying, and now a judge is going to destroy my case for illegal appointment? This is a coordinated smear campaign, Marcus, and Comey is the architect. Her voice was a low growl, the frustration and anger bubbling to the surface. The problem, AG, is that Comey has a history of making serious accusations, and the media tends to lend them weight, regardless of the evidence. Remember the Clinton email investigation? The constant leaks, the carefully worded statements? He knows how to manipulate the narrative. Pam walked back to her desk and picked up the manila envelope. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of the unseen accusations, the invisible threads pulling taut around her. This wasn't just about a past settlement. It was about her future, her legacy, her very character. "What's in this envelope, Marcus?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Marcus swallowed hard. "It's a preliminary indictment from a special counsel appointed by Comey's allies in the DOJ. It outlines the charges: obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and a conspiracy to conceal evidence in the Trump University case. And then, as a separate but related charge, it details the alleged illegality of Judge Vance's appointment." Pam's eyes widened. Obstruction of justice? Witness tampering? These were serious federal charges, and the implication of her involvement in Judge Vance's appointment was damning. "This is insane," she exclaimed, slamming her hand on the desk. The sound echoed through the office. "I did nothing wrong. I acted within the bounds of the law. This is a political witch hunt, pure and simple." "And Comey is the Grand Inquisitor," Marcus added grimly. "He's positioned himself as the arbiter of truth, and he's decided you're an obstacle." Pam sank into her chair, the fight draining out of her for a brief, terrifying moment. The weight of it all, the sheer audacity of the accusations, threatened to crush her. She could see the headlines, the talking heads dissecting her every move, twisting her words, painting her as the villain. "He's attacking me to rebuild himself," she whispered, more to herself than to Marcus. "He's using me as a stepping stone." "That's the narrative he's creating, AG," Marcus confirmed. "He's painting himself as the righteous crusader, exposing corruption in the highest levels of government, and he's timed it perfectly. Just as the political winds are shifting, he's dropped this bombshell. He wants to be seen as the man who brought down a prominent Republican official." Pam looked at the manila envelope again. It represented not just a legal threat, but an existential one. Her career, her reputation, everything she had worked for, was now hanging precariously in the balance. The appointment of Judge Vance, she mused, her mind already shifting into strategic mode, the survival instinct kicking in. That's the weak point in their fabricated narrative. That process was transparent. We followed every protocol. We had a selection committee. This is where we fight back. They're claiming the committee was handpicked and that the best qualified candidates were overlooked. They've even dredged up an old email you sent to a former colleague discussing potential judicial nominees. They're calling it pre-selection evidence. Pam shook her head, a mirthless chuckle escaping her lips. Pre-selection? I was looking for qualified individuals to serve our state. That's not a crime, that's responsible governance. But in the current climate, with Comey leading the charge, it's being framed as a conspiracy, Marcus said. The narrative is that you manipulated the system to get a judge who owed you a favor. Pam stood up again, her posture straightening, the initial shock giving way to a steely resolve. She wasn't going to crumble. She wouldn't let Comey and his cronies destroy her. This special counsel, who appointed him? She asked, her voice regaining its power. A panel of judges appointed by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, based on Comey's recommendation and compelling evidence he presented. Pam's eyes narrowed. Comey's recommendation. Of course. This is his carefully constructed coup de grace. He's not just indicting me, he's trying to indict the entire system if it doesn't align with his distorted view of justice. The leaks are relentless, AG. Every hour, there's something new. A snippet of an interview Comey gave to a private podcast, a cryptic tweet from a former FBI agent who claims to be deeply concerned, an anonymous source within the DOJ alleging systemic issues. It's a psychological war, and they're attacking from all sides. Pam walked over to a bookshelf, her fingers tracing the spines of law books, the tangible symbols of her profession. They want me to break. They want me to confess to something I didn't do. They want me to be a sacrificial lamb in Comey's resurrection tour. She turned back to Marcus, a fierce glint in her eyes. Well, they've underestimated me. They've always underestimated me. This isn't the end, Marcus. This is the beginning of a fight. And I intend to win. She walked back to her desk, her movements purposeful and deliberate. She picked up the manila envelope, no longer a harbinger of doom, but a target. Get me my legal team, all of them. I want to see every shred of evidence they claim to have. Every email, every transcript, every whisper. We're going to dissect this conspiracy piece by piece, and when we're done, we're going to expose James Comey for the hypocrite and the opportunist he truly is. The Tallahassee sun, though still obscured by the heavy air, seemed to momentarily break through the clouds, casting a single, defiant beam onto Pam Bondi's determined face. The shadow play had begun, but Pam was no longer a victim of its illusions. She was ready to step into the light and fight. The game was on, and she was playing to win. The sterile hum of the courthouse was a stark contrast to the simmering tension that had permeated the air for weeks. Pam Bondi, still reeling from the unexpected indictment of James Comey, found herself in a precarious position. The legal maneuvering had been swift, brutal, and frankly, unexpected. The narrative being woven by her opponents wasn't just about a political disagreement, it was about corruption, abuse of power, and the erosion of justice. And at the center of it all, she was the target. Scene 1, The Ghost in the Machine. Pam's office, usually a sanctuary of focused legal strategy, felt claustrophobic. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, cast long, accusing shadows across her desk. She stared at the pile of documents, each one a potential weapon in the hands of her attackers. The Comey indictment, once a triumphant declaration, now felt like a poisoned chalice. "This is insane, Michael," she said, her voice tight with a frustration she was struggling to contain. Michael, her seasoned chief of staff, a man who had navigated more political storms than Pam cared to count, stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the cityscape below. "They're using it, Pam. They're twisting it," Michael replied, his voice low and measured. "The narrative is out. Bondi, the vindictive prosecutor, going after Comey for daring to cross her. And now, this appointment issue, it's like they had it waiting in the wings." Pam slammed a hand on the desk. "Waiting? Who? Who has been digging into this for so long? This wasn't a casual observation. This was a surgical strike." The indictment against Comey for alleged perjury was meant to be her counteroffensive, a bold move to expose what she saw as Comey's transgressions. Now it felt like it had backfired, amplifying her critics' voices. The whispers started after the Comey news broke. Then the leaks, little pieces strategically placed, Michael explained, turning to face her. His usual unflappable demeanor was showing cracks. First, there were anonymous sources talking about procedural irregularities in your appointment to that special prosecutor role. Then, the confidential memos started appearing. Pam's blood ran cold. The special prosecutor role she'd taken on, a brief but intensely scrutinized period of her career, was meant to be a demonstration of her commitment to justice. Now it was being weaponized. Memos? What memos? Documents questioning the legitimacy of the appointment process, implied conflicts of interest, questions about your qualifications for that specific, albeit temporary task. The timing is just too perfect. Michael's eyes met hers, a shared understanding passing between them. This wasn't a random attack, it was coordinated. They're painting me as someone who manipulated the system to serve my own agenda, Pam said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. And the irony is, I was trying to uphold the very principles they now accuse me of violating. She recalled the intense pressure to take on the special prosecutor role, the promise of a clear, decisive outcome. Now that decision was being used to dismantle her. The key is illegal appointment, Pam, Michael continued, his brow furrowed. It's a legal term, and coming from a judge, it carries immense weight. They're not just saying you made a mistake. They're saying you acted unlawfully, and that opens the door for everything else. Pam stood up, pacing the confines of her office. She felt a surge of defiance mixed with a chilling dread. So what are they saying? That my entire investigation, my findings in that special prosecutor case, are tainted because of how I got there? That's precisely the narrative they want to sell, Michael confirmed grimly. And the judge, Judge Sterling, he's known for his rigid adherence to procedure. He wouldn't be swayed by political pressure, but he's also not afraid to make a bold statement. If he rules your appointment was illegal, it's a devastating blow. The mention of Judge Sterling sent a fresh wave of unease through Pam. She knew his reputation. He was a legal purist, a man who respected the letter of the law above all else. And the thought of him dissecting her appointment with a fine-tooth comb, looking for any conceivable flaw, made her stomach clench. She had been confident in the legality of her appointment, but the sheer volume of attacks, the meticulous leaks, made her question even the most solid foundations. Who is feeding him this information, Michael? Who is orchestrating this symphony of destruction? Pam demanded, her voice a low growl. Michael sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. That's the million-dollar question, Pam. The fingerprints are everywhere, but the architect is still in the shadows. It smells like a coordinated effort from the opposition, likely with internal leaks from, well, places we thought were secure. The implication hung heavy in the air. Betrayal. The thought was a bitter pill to swallow. Who among her trusted circle would willingly hand over ammunition to her enemies? We need to get ahead of this, Pam declared, her voice firming with resolve. We need to get to Judge Sterling, lay out the facts. But how do we counter something that's already been presented as fact, even if it's a distorted version? That's where the legal battle begins, Pam, Michael said, his eyes holding a glint of steel. And it's going to be ugly. Scene 2. The whispers turned to shouts. The legal community buzzed with the news. The Comey indictment, initially seen as a power play by Bondi, had inadvertently opened the floodgates. Now the focus had shifted, and the whispers about her appointment were growing louder, amplified by the mainstream media and influential legal commentators. Pam found herself on the defensive, a position she abhorred. Every press conference, every public appearance was a minefield. She was asked not about the substance of the Comey case, but about the legitimacy of her own actions. Ms. Bondi, reports indicate that a federal judge is reviewing the legality of your appointment as special prosecutor. Can you comment on those claims? A persistent reporter shouted during a press gaggle. Pam forced a smile, her heart pounding. My focus has always been on justice and upholding the law. Any legal process will reveal the integrity of my actions. It was a standard, polished response, but she knew it was no longer enough. Back in her office, the phone rang incessantly. It was a mix of concerned allies and opportunistic vultures. One call, however, stood out. It was from a former colleague, a prosecutor she deeply respected, who now worked in a different jurisdiction. "Pam, are you all right?" The voice on the other end was hushed, urgent. "I'm hearing things, bad things." "What kind of things?" Pam asked, her guard up. "About the appointment." "They're digging into the procedural records, the memos. It sounds like they've found a loophole, or at least are framing it that way." "Someone is feeding them information, Pam. High-level information." "Who?" Pam pressed, her voice sharp. There was a pause. "I can't say for sure, but it feels like someone who had access, someone who knew the details of how that appointment was made." The implication was chilling, a leak from within her own ranks. "This isn't just about politics anymore," Pam said, her voice hardening. "This is a targeted attack, designed to discredit me completely." Later that day, Michael walked in, his face grim. "The latest filing from the judge's chambers. They've formally scheduled a hearing to address the legality of the special prosecutor appointment, and they've cited those leaked memos as their primary evidence." Pam snatched the document, her eyes scanning the legal jargon. The language was precise, damning. "Illegal appointment." The words echoed the fear that had been growing in her gut. "This is where it gets dangerous, Pam," Michael said, his voice laced with concern. "If Judge Sterling agrees with their assessment, it could invalidate everything you did as special prosecutor. That means the Comey indictment, any findings, any actions taken, it all becomes questionable." "Questionable? It becomes tainted," Pam retorted, her voice rising. "They're not just trying to win a legal battle, they're trying to destroy my reputation, my career. They want to make me look like a charlatan, a lawbreaker." The psychological warfare was relentless. Every news cycle brought a new wave of speculation, a new accusation amplified by her opponents. They painted her as a power-hungry prosecutor, willing to bend the rules for personal gain. The Comey indictment, once her weapon, was now being framed as evidence of her vindictive nature. "They're using your own aggression against you, Pam," Michael observed, his tone somber. "The aggressive move with Comey, it made you a target. Now they're framing this appointment issue as the perfect counterstrike, a way to neutralize you and delegitimize your entire pursuit." Pam felt a surge of anger, but beneath it, a cold fear was taking root. She had always believed in her own rectitude, her unwavering commitment to the law. But the sheer force of this coordinated assault, the speed at which it had escalated, was overwhelming. "Who benefits the most from this, Michael?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the document. "Who gains if my credibility is shattered?" "Everyone who has something to hide," Michael replied without hesitation. "And everyone who sees you as a threat. This isn't just about Comey or your appointment, it's about dismantling a prosecutor who isn't afraid to go after powerful people." The leaks continued. Anonymous sources spewed carefully crafted narratives to the press, painting a picture of Pam as a rogue prosecutor who had abused her authority. One particular leak, a purported internal email from her office discussing the appointment, was particularly damaging. It was presented as evidence of her awareness of potential procedural issues, a clear indication of intent to circumvent the rules. Pam knew that email was a fabrication, or at best a heavily manipulated excerpt. But how could she prove it when the narrative had already taken hold? The psychological impact was immense. She felt scrutinized, judged, and her own confidence began to waver. The constant barrage of accusations, the feeling of being under siege, was taking its toll. She saw the doubt in the eyes of some allies, the gleeful anticipation in the faces of her enemies. "They've set a trap, Pam," Michael said, his voice heavy. "And the Comey indictment, it was the bait that led you right into it. Now they're tightening the noose with this appointment issue." Pam closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The pressure was immense. The weight of the legal and political onslaught felt crushing. She had attacked, and now she was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece. The aggressive prosecutor who had launched the Comey indictment was now exposed, vulnerable, and facing the terrifying prospect of her case, her reputation, and her career collapsing around her. The judge's impending ruling on her appointment loomed like a guillotine, threatening to sever her from the very justice she had sworn to uphold. The unraveling had begun. Scene 3. The judge's gavel. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was occupied, every vantage point claimed by reporters, legal observers, and the curious public. The air crackled with anticipation. Pam Bondi sat at the defense table, her posture erect, her gaze fixed on Judge Sterling. Beside her, Michael looked as tense as she felt, his knuckles white as he gripped his legal pad. Judge Sterling, a man whose reputation preceded him as a stern arbiter of justice, entered the courtroom. His presence commanded silence. He settled into his chair, his expression unreadable. The proceeding began with a dispassionate reading of the arguments presented by both sides regarding Pam's appointment as special prosecutor. The prosecution's team, led by a sharp, ambitious prosecutor named Anya Sharma, laid out their case with chilling precision. They meticulously detailed the procedural steps, or rather, the alleged lack thereof, in Pam's appointment. They presented the leaked documents, the supposed internal emails, and the testimony of anonymous sources who painted a damning picture of a rushed, politically motivated appointment. Anya Sharma's voice was clear and unwavering as she declared, "Your Honor, the evidence unequivocally demonstrates that Ms. Bondi's appointment was not only irregular, but fundamentally illegal. This casts a shadow over any actions she took under that purported authority." Pam listened, her jaw tight. She knew the counter-arguments, the legal justifications for her appointment. She had reviewed them countless times with her legal team. But hearing them systematically dissected and refuted by Sharma felt like a physical blow. When it was her turn to present, Pam took a deep breath. Michael had prepared a meticulous legal defense, highlighting the specific statutes and precedents that supported her appointment. She spoke with conviction, her voice resonating with the truth as she saw it. "Your Honor," Pam began, her voice steady, "the process of my appointment, while perhaps expedited due to the urgency of the investigation, was undertaken in good faith and in accordance with the applicable legal framework. The allegations of impropriety are being weaponized to undermine the very principles of justice I sought to uphold." She argued that the perceived irregularities were minor procedural deviations, common in high-pressure investigations, and that the core legal requirements for such an appointment had been met. She highlighted the public interest in pursuing the investigation she was assigned and the lack of any personal gain or ulterior motive on her part. Judge Sterling listened, his gaze unwavering. He asked pointed questions, dissecting the legal arguments, probing for inconsistencies. He seemed unconcerned with the political theater surrounding the case, focusing solely on the legal merits. Then came the moment Pam dreaded. Judge Sterling cleared his throat. The courtroom fell silent, every ear straining to hear. "This court has thoroughly reviewed the arguments and evidence presented," Judge Sterling stated, his voice resonating with authority. "The matter before us is not one of political expediency, but of legal standing. The foundational legality of an authority rests upon the validity of its appointment." Pam held her breath. "While the court acknowledges the intent behind Ms. Bondi's actions," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the assembled figures, "the procedural deficiencies, as presented and substantiated by the evidence, are, in this court's assessment, significant. The appointment process, as detailed in the filings and supporting documentation, demonstrates a clear departure from the established legal requirements for appointing a special prosecutor in such a capacity." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Pam felt a cold dread creep up her spine. "Therefore," Judge Sterling declared, his voice a somber pronouncement, "this court rules that the appointment of Ms. Pam Bondi as special prosecutor in this matter was indeed illegal. Consequently, any actions taken and any findings made under that invalid authority are, in the eyes of the law, null and void." The gavel slammed down, a sound that echoed like a death knell in the hushed courtroom. The judge had spoken. Her case, the very foundation of her recent aggressive pursuit, had been utterly destroyed. The carefully constructed edifice of her legal strategy crumbled around her. The Comey indictment, the aggressive push that had defined her recent actions, now seemed like a desperate gamble that had backfired spectacularly. She was no longer the attacker. She was the attacked, exposed and collapsing under the weight of the legal decree. The narrative of the vindictive prosecutor was being cemented, and Pam Bondi found herself staring into the abyss of her own professional ruin. The silence in the courtroom was deafening, punctuated only by the distant hum of the world outside, a world that was already rewriting her story, one devastating legal ruling at a time. The courtroom air, thick with the scent of old paper and unspoken accusations, hummed with a tension that had been building for weeks. It was a quiet hum, a predator's purr before the final pounce. Pam Bondi sat at the defense table, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on the judge, though her mind was a whirlwind of strategy and suppressed anxiety. The prosecution, led by a prosecutor whose name was now etched in the annals of political infamy, a young firebrand named Marcus Thorne, had painted her as a manipulator, a corrupt official who had weaponized her office. The indictment itself had been a gut punch. Accused of lying to the FBI regarding her interaction with James Comey, a former director of the Bureau, about an investigation into a real estate developer. The initial filing had been swift, brutal, and accompanied by a deafening media roar. Bondi had felt the initial shock, the visceral betrayal of the system she had sworn to uphold. But then, something within her had hardened. A fierce, almost primal instinct for survival had kicked in. She wasn't going down like this, not for lies she hadn't told. The judge, Justice Eleanor Vance, a woman whose reputation for impartiality was as solid as the marble pillars of the courthouse, had been observing the proceedings with a quiet intensity. Her face was a mask of professional detachment, but her eyes, sharp and discerning, missed nothing. The initial phase of the trial had been a brutal onslaught from Thorne's team. They had presented emails, witness testimonies, and circumstantial evidence, all designed to paint Bondi as a corrupt pawn. Then came the bombshell. A meticulously researched legal challenge from Bondi's defense, led by the seasoned but now increasingly weary Eleanor Dubois, questioning the very legitimacy of Bondi's appointment to the Special Investigative Committee that had initiated the Comey inquiry. Dubois had unearthed obscure procedural bylaws, ignored for years, that suggested Bondi's participation was, at best, questionable, and at worst, an illegal overreach of authority. This was the pivot. Thorne, so accustomed to a swift, decisive victory, had been caught off guard. His aggressive, accusatory style, so effective against the initial indictment, now seemed like a desperate flailing. The jury, initially swayed by the prosecution's narrative, began to shift. Doubt, a subtle but potent force, began to creep into their expressions. "Your Honor," Dubois's voice, though soft, echoed with the weight of her argument. "The evidence presented clearly demonstrates that the committee, and thus any subsequent investigation initiated by it, was improperly constituted. Therefore, any actions taken under its purview, including the indictment of Ms. Bondi, are fundamentally flawed and illegitimate." The prosecutor, Thorne, visibly bristled. He had dismissed the defense's initial filings as mere legal theatrics, a desperate attempt to distract from the core accusations. Now he was forced to confront the possibility that his entire case rested on a shaky foundation. He had prepared for a battle of ethics and integrity, not a technicality that threatened to dismantle everything he had built. "Objection, Your Honor." Thorne's voice, usually so controlled, crackled with frustration. "Counsel is attempting to introduce extraneous legal arguments to muddy the waters. The issue at hand is Ms. Bondi's alleged deception." Justice Vance raised a hand, silencing Thorne. Her gaze, steady and unwavering, met Dubois'. "Counsel, please proceed. The court must consider all pertinent legal arguments." The next few days were a grueling examination of procedural minutiae, a far cry from the dramatic accusations of corruption that had fueled the initial headlines. Thorne's team, accustomed to a more straightforward prosecutorial approach, struggled to adapt. Their witnesses, who had testified with righteous indignation about Bondi's supposed transgressions, found themselves being cross-examined on the technicalities of committee appointments and departmental regulations. Pam Bondi watched it all unfold, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach with each passing minute. She had survived the initial onslaught, had clung to her innocence with a fierce tenacity. But the legal system was a labyrinth, and the path to vindication was often as treacherous as the path to indictment. Thorne, sensing his control slipping, grew more aggressive. His closing arguments became a desperate plea for the jury to look beyond the legal technicalities and focus on the perceived moral failing of Pam Bondi. He painted a picture of a powerful woman abusing her position, a narrative that had resonated with many. "Members of the jury," Thorne's voice boomed, "we are not here to debate the niceties of bureaucratic procedure. We are here to address a profound betrayal of public trust. Ms. Bondi lied. She lied to the FBI. She obstructed justice. This is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of fact." He gestured dramatically towards Bondi, who met his gaze with a steely resolve. She had faced down political storms before, weathered the fiercest of attacks. This was just another battle, albeit one fought on a more treacherous terrain. Then came the defense's closing. Eleanor Dubois, her voice calm and deliberate, wove a narrative of due process and the importance of legal integrity. She didn't shy away from the initial accusations, but she systematically dismantled them, highlighting the lack of concrete evidence and the procedural irregularities. The prosecution asks you to believe that Ms. Bondi fabricated her interactions with Director Comey, Dubois stated, her eyes sweeping across the jury. They ask you to disregard the fact that the very body that initiated this investigation was itself operating outside the bounds of established law. If the foundation of a house is rotten, can you truly trust what is built upon it? Can you truly hold the builder responsible for its eventual collapse? She paused, letting the rhetorical question hang in the air. Ms. Bondi may have been targeted, she may have been put through an ordeal that has shaken her to her core, but she did not lie. And her actions, even if questioned by the prosecution, were conducted within a framework that, as we have now seen, was fundamentally compromised. The tension in the courtroom reached its zenith as the jury retired to deliberate. The hours that followed felt like an eternity. Pam Bondi sat with her legal team, the silence punctuated by the ticking of the clock and the occasional hushed whisper. She closed her eyes, picturing the faces of her supporters, her family, the people who believed in her. She had to believe in herself. Then the bailiff appeared at the door, a somber figure announcing the jury's return. The courtroom hushed. The air grew heavy, expectant. Pam Bondi's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the moment of truth. Justice Vance entered the courtroom, her expression unreadable. She took her seat, and the jury foreman, a man with a weary but determined look, rose to deliver the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Pam Bondi." The words hung in the air, suspended in a moment of agonizing anticipation. Pam Bondi's breath hitched. "Not guilty." The courtroom erupted. A collective gasp, followed by a wave of murmurs, and then, for some, applause. Pam Bondi's knees felt weak. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the table, her gaze fixed on the foreman. "Not guilty." The words resonated, a balm to her battered spirit. Thorne, across the aisle, stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. His carefully constructed narrative, his aggressive prosecution, had crumbled. The legal technicality, the one he had so readily dismissed, had proven to be the undoing of his entire case. He looked like a boxer who had thrown his best punch, only to find his opponent had already moved out of the way. Justice Vance, her gavel poised, brought the courtroom back to order. Her gaze fell on Thorne, and for the first time, a flicker of something akin to disappointment, or perhaps pity, crossed her stern features. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority, "the court recognizes the dedication of your team. However, a prosecution must be built on solid legal ground. In this instance, it appears that ground was not as firm as anticipated." She then turned her attention to Pam Bondi, her expression softening slightly. "Ms. Bondi, the court commends you for your resilience throughout this challenging ordeal. The verdict of this jury is final." As the courtroom emptied, Pam Bondi felt a profound sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't a triumphant roar, but a deep, soul-cleansing exhale. She had been attacked, smeared, and pushed to the brink. But she had endured. She had been vindicated. Later, in the quiet of her office, the noise of the media circus finally receding, Pam Bondi sat with Eleanor Dubois. The victory, though sweet, was laced with the weariness of the battle. "They wanted to break me, Eleanor," Bondi said, her voice raspy with emotion. "They wanted to make an example out of me." Dubois nodded, her own exhaustion evident. "And they almost did. But they underestimated your strength, Pam, and they underestimated the importance of the law, even its most intricate details. The integrity of the process, in the end, was what saved you." Bondi looked out the window, the city lights a distant glow. The indictment had been a brutal attack, designed to shatter her reputation and end her career. It had felt like a betrayal of everything she believed in. But in the crucible of the courtroom, stripped bare of political armor, she had found a deeper strength. The resilience that had always been within her had been tested and forged anew. The experience had changed her. The aggressive pursuit of justice, so vital in her role, now felt tempered by a newfound appreciation for the delicate balance of fairness and procedure. She had been an attacker, in a sense, a prosecutor fighting for what she believed was right. But she had also been the target, vulnerable and exposed. Now she was the vindicated, a survivor. The Comey affair, the real estate developer scandal, the indictment, it was all part of a dramatic, often brutal, political play. She had been cast as a villain, an agent of corruption. But the final act had rewritten the script. The collapse had been thorns, the legal unraveling a testament to the power of meticulous defense, and her own rebirth, though scarred, was complete. The news cycles would eventually move on. The political drama would fade into the background, replaced by new controversies and new targets. But for Pam Bondi, this chapter was closed. The scars remained, a reminder of the attack. But the vindication was a powerful testament to her resilience, a quiet declaration that even in the face of overwhelming opposition, the truth and the law could ultimately prevail. She had faced the abyss, and she had emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken. The fight had been brutal, the stakes impossibly high, but she had survived, not just as a survivor, but as someone who had been reborn in the fires of her own trial.